In this video, we're going to be talking about how you can translate some really complex objects into a simplified profile in order to get the ellipses more accurate. With many of the objects that you choose to draw, there are very few ellipses to worry about, and it's pretty easy to just draw it from observation sitting out in front of you. But when you choose something that's much more complex, like this pepper grinder, there are so many width changes on this object and places where we've got curves and other things to consider that it can be kind of overwhelming and you can get lost in the drawing. So one way to help you simplify it and keep proportions accurate before you start drawing the ellipses is to trace it, actually. So I'm going to give you that as an option for very complex objects like this. It really only works with cylindrical objects that are the same from every point of view, but it is something that I'm going to allow you to do on these homework assignments so that you can choose some things that are a little bit more complicated, like the objects that are in the drawing below by a past student, that things that have quite a few curves, or like there's a little pawn in the bottom center there. And that might be a little bit overwhelming to draw unless you have a way to help you out to get started. So when we have our object, one approach is to simply lay it down, try not to let it shift around too much, and then you'll be using your pencil to kind of trace the outline. I've already done this to save a little bit of time, and my original drawing is not symmetrical at all, so we need to clean up the drawing a little bit before we can proceed. So one thing I'd like to do is kind of estimate where the halfway point is on this object to kind of get a midline. And then we'll try to make it a little more symmetrical before we go any farther. So we'll just kind of sketch in some things. I notice my curve here is really asymmetrical relative to this one, so I want to try to make them look a little bit more similar from side to side. And sometimes the way I'll do that is I'll just kind of compare the distance from the midline on both sides to give myself sort of a dot-to-dot template to follow. I'm going to center this again, on the ellipse. And then the other thing we want to make sure is that the horizontals are really pretty straight there. When you freehand draw it, it's going to be not as accurate. So double check that this is about as thick as that one. Kind of refine the curves a little bit if you need to. And then also we do want to make sure that these stay pretty perpendicular. Again, here I drew this side quite a bit fatter than the other one, so you can just kind of use a light sketch. And again, I want to make sure that this part is pretty much the same. That looks pretty good there. So you're just cleaning up your basic silhouette of the object first. So right now, this object looks very flat. There's no sense of the roundness of those ellipses, so we're going to be adding that in later. This one I drew way too far out there, so I'm trying to make it look pretty symmetrical before I go any farther. And you might clean up some of your extra lines so that you know for sure which ones to follow. And then we start thinking about the ellipses. So we know if we're drawing this object from top view, our ellipses are going to be flattest at the top and getting rounder and rounder as it gets below us. If we're drawing this object from the underside, then our flattest ellipses, of course, would be the ones that are on the visible end of the object, and the ellipses that we can't see as well would be the ones that are rounder. So you could use this technique for drawing your object below eye level, your object above eye level. You could probably even do it if you were trying to draw an object right on your eye level. Oops, we're dropping pepper. And it might be a little bit harder to draw it as an object on its side unless you're not foreshortening it very much. This technique would not work for your fifth assignment, which is drawing an extremely foreshortened view of the object. That you do have to draw from observation because the proportions really change when you're looking at it from such a steep angle. But this technique does work for the simpler assignments. The assignment 1, 2, and 3 would work pretty well for this technique. So let's say that we're drawing it more from slightly top view, so we'll kind of imagine what those ellipses might need to look like. And at this point I'm going to set it out in front of me and do some measuring so that I can start to plot out the proportions. And this is going to take quite a bit of measuring using my locked elbow and my skewer, and it's probably going to be half an hour to an hour worth of just comparing ellipse measurements. But once I get to that point, I'll come back and we'll finish up darkening in the ellipses so you can see what's going to happen. But one thing I do want to do before I get to that point is I'm going to put in a few landmarks that are going to be the centers of a whole bunch of different ellipses. So anywhere that the object changes width, this curve is still not quite symmetrical, anywhere that the curves, like the fattest part of each curve, we're going to need to put an ellipse in. The narrowest part of each curve, I want you to put an ellipse in. Every place we change from a curved to a straight surface, we're going to add another line. So go ahead and put in all these horizontal guidelines. These, again, will become the center of each different ellipse. So we've got two ellipses here that are going to meet, one for the narrow part of the cylinder and one for the wider part of the cylinder, and then we'll have another ellipse here. So put in all of those horizontal axis lines that will become the center of each one of our ellipses. And then the other thing that's going to change here, from side view, that little ball is right at the very top of the object. It kind of sits on top. But the minute we start to turn the pepper grinder so that we're looking down on it, that little ball needs to shift into the shape a little bit more. So I will fix that as well before I go any farther. So I'm just going to move that metal ball down a tiny bit so it's actually inside this. And then when we go to draw this top ellipse, we'll be able to let that ellipse surround and enclose that ball. But before I can draw any of the ellipses, I need to take quite a few measurements. So I'll pause the video for a minute. Okay, we're back. And in the meantime, what I've done is I used a different color dotted line to represent the center line of all these various points. So I used a blue dotted line for all parts of the pepper grinder that were the full width. So there's 2 points down here, 2 points here, the fattest part of this bulge I also used a blue line for. I used a red line for the narrower part, so things that are similar distances like this narrowest part of the waist, and then the narrow part of this, the body of the pepper grinder that's a little bit narrower, just so in my own mind I could keep track of all the ellipses, because in some places we've got two ellipses on the same horizontal line. For example, we have this wider part that you grab onto, it shares the same center line as this narrower ellipse that's in here. So anyway, I'm going to be drawing sometimes two ellipses in the same plane, and coloring it just helps it keep it straight in my mind. You certainly do not need to color code your center lines, but just as far as instruction goes, I think it's going to help me explain it a little bit better. So at this point, I've already done a lot of measuring. I kind of noticed that the base of the pepper grinder is about 2.5 times as wide as it is tall when I'm looking at that base ellipse in the real life pepper grinder. And then as we get higher up on the form, the ellipses are getting flatter and flatter because they're approaching our eye level, which is way up here, probably off the top of the page. So I've gone ahead and plotted out some dotted lines to help me get my ellipses nice and smooth, and now I'm just to the point where I'm going to start darkening them in. So I'm going to start with the very bottom ellipse, and so the center of that ellipse are these two dots. Yeah, I erased, I lightened the line that was the original silhouette that I had traced, because these are going to now have to be curves. But in a lot of the other places I did darken in the contours, because that part of the object looked pretty similar regardless of whether I was looking at it completely from side view or if it was slightly tipped. So I kept these curves, and I did resolve where that silver ball is going to be on the top. So starting at the bottom here, the front part of that ellipse will be darkened in, the part that would be visible. And the back side, I'm going to use a dotted line. This is going to get kind of complicated because we're going to have so many dotted lines back here, but it is important to think about how far those lines are going to go back there. I feel like, yeah, that's not too bad. My center line shifted a little bit, I think, since my original measurements. So I've got the back side of that ellipse, and I still feel like I went a little bit too far up, maybe. Bring that down a tiny bit. Then the second ellipse is the same width this part of the pepper grinder is the same width as this one, and it's so close to this one that I feel like I can get by with using the exact same ratio of those two ellipses. So what I'm going to do is, once I've kind of thought about where this first ellipse is, I'm going to take that same ellipse in my mind and just sort of shift it up a quarter of an inch or so and redraw it. So now I've got the second edge of the pepper grinder here, and again I'm keeping track of where the midpoint is, this blue line here, and actually it corresponds to where the red line is too. And then the back side of that we actually will see here, because on the pepper grinder you actually see that ellipse continuing around behind the narrower part of the cylinder. So I will draw that part as a solid line, and then when it goes back behind the plexi of the pepper grinder, that part will be a dotted line since it's out of view. But again, try to keep this nice and rounded, don't let it get pointy here. And then there's a second ellipse that's smaller, so we need to get the ellipse that represents this portion of the pepper grinder, and it's going to have the red line as its center point. But I'm going to try to keep that same ratio of width to height, so I don't want this one to get super flat or super round. It needs to just sort of fit within the other ellipse. So I'm going to go ahead and pencil that in lightly too. And we'll darken in the front half of that ellipse, and we'll use a dotted line for the back half just to make sure it's seen as being farther away from us. So we've got the base drawn out, then we move up a little bit higher. So again, I'm going to start with the bottom edge of this part of it and draw that ellipse in. This is the blue line. This ellipse needs to be a little bit flatter, so I've already measured that out. It's closer to 1 to 3 times as wide as it is tall. And the back side of that, again, you need to remember to draw it transparently. So if the blue line's the halfway, I want to go up about the same distance above there and draw that part as a dotted line. And then there's another one just like this, another one just a quarter inch above it that I need to darken in as well. And again, it doesn't stop right here, because as we're looking down on it, we can see that, in fact, it kind of slopes down, and we may have to modify that a little bit as we go. But for now, I'm just going to draw as if we could see it going around the back side here. And again, if this is a quarter inch higher than the first ellipse, then the back side should also be about a quarter inch higher, so you can double check those things to make sure you're not distorting it too much on the back side. Okay, and then this line might still stay there just to kind of show that that's all right. We're going to need an ellipse. Even though there's not a line on the actual object, I do ask you to put a ellipse everywhere that the object changes width. So I will add one more here just for give a sense of the roundness of that. And the back side would be here. Again, this ellipse ratio should be really similar to the one that we just drew. That's so close to it. This one's a little higher up, so things are getting gradually a little bit flatter. Here I'm using, I'm fitting the height of this ellipse into the width 3.5 times, so it's a little bit flatter since it's getting closer to our eye level. And the back side of that would be about here, and dotted lines so it doesn't confuse things too much. And then there's actually a few implied, even though I can't feel them on this, I can see that there's another ellipse on that plastic part. So I'll draw that in as well. I've got to stay pretty flat here, so I'm going to try to make it about 4 times, or 3.5 to 4 times as wide as it is tall. And there was a second one in there too. So anyway, you're just going to draw these little details as if you could see through the object. And then at the very top, there's this little ridge that runs around the silver ball. And this is the center of that ellipse, but I'm going to draw it in as if we could see through it. So again, a dotted line on the back side, and you can make a double line there since you see that kind of ridge there. All right, so I think we've got a pretty good indication of all the information here. You could even, since we can see through this object, I can see the little post that runs down the middle. So you can draw that kind of thing in too if you want to try to get those extra bonus points for being super observant. I'm not going to draw all the pepper in there, but you could kind of suggest it if you wanted to, just for fun. But So there we are with our pepper grinder